I am Alexia, 32 years old, and until last month, I was the Chief Accountant at StartSphere Technologies, a leading fintech software company where I dedicated 6 years of my career. I built a reputation for financial transparency and ethical accounting practices, so when I received that calendar invite for my exit interview, I was shocked. What my bosses did not know was how much I had discovered about their $2 million special project over the past 6 months. Before I tell you how I fought back against this unfair termination, let me know where you are watching from, and do not forget to like and subscribe to hear more real stories from behind the glossy facade of the tech industry. StartSphere Technologies was not just any software company. We specialized in financial technology solutions that helped other businesses manage their accounting, payroll, and investment portfolios. Our flagship product, Finance Flow, was used by over 5,000 companies across North America. As Chief Accountant, I oversaw a team of 15 accountants and financial analysts, ensuring that our own finances were as meticulously managed as we promised our clients their finances would be. My office was on the 23rd floor of a sleek glass building in downtown Chicago. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered spectacular views of Lake Michigan, and on clear days I could see for miles. The modern workspace was designed to foster creativity and collaboration with open plan, seating casual meeting areas, with comfortable couches, and a well-stocked kitchen that was always filled with organic snacks and premium coffee. It was the kind of place that made people proud to work there. Among my closest colleagues were Melissa, a senior accountant, with a sharp eye for detail and a wickedly funny sense of humor, and Jordan, an IT specialist, who always had solutions for our technical problems, and brought homemade cookies to the office every Friday. We often had lunch together, sharing stories about our weekends, discussing the latest industry trends, and occasionally venting about work pressures. They were not just colleagues, they were friends who made the long hours and high pressure worthwhile. The company culture, at least on the surface, was everything you would expect from a successful tech firm. We had quarterly team-building retreats, flexible working hours, generous benefits, and a management style that supposedly valued transparency and employee input. The CEO, Daniel Hughes, had been featured in Business Insider as one of the top 40 under 40 entrepreneurs to watch. He was charismatic, impeccably dressed, and had a way of making every employee feel seen and valued when he spoke at company meetings. Daniel had built StartSphere from a small startup to a company valued at over $200 million in just 8 years. His background included an MBA from Wharton and a brief stint at Goldman Sachs before he ventured into entrepreneurship. He was known for his inspirational speeches about innovation and disruption, and many employees, including myself, genuinely admired his vision and leadership in the early years. My direct boss was Richard Maxwell, the Chief Financial Officer. Richard was in his early 40s with salt and pepper hair and a preference for custom-tailored suits. He had been with the company for 5 years and had played a significant role in preparing the company for its planned IPO next year. Initially, Richard was supportive and appreciative of my work. He would often praise my attention to detail in meetings and seemed to value my input on financial decisions. "Alexia, your quarterly reports are always flawless," he once told me after a board meeting. "I never have to worry when you are handling the numbers." Comments like these made me feel secure in my position and proud of my contributions to the company. The first sign that something might be amiss came about 8 months ago. I was reviewing our departmental budget allocations when I noticed a substantial sum, approximately $300,000, had been earmarked for something called Project Phoenix. This was unusual because I was familiar with all our current projects, and Phoenix was not one I recognized. When I inquired about it during our next finance meeting, Richard dismissed it casually. "Oh, that is just a special R&D initiative that Daniel is personally overseeing. Nothing to worry about." He quickly changed the subject, but I noted a slight tension in his voice that had not been there before. Around the same time, we received notification that an external auditor would be conducting our annual audit, which was standard practice for a company of our size, especially one preparing for an IPO. James Wilson, from Anderson Financial Oversight, was assigned to our company. He was a seasoned auditor with over 20 years of experience, known for his thoroughness and integrity. From our first meeting, I found James to be professional and approachable. He explained his process clearly and emphasized that he was there to help ensure our financial health, not to cause problems. Over the next 6 months, James and I worked closely together as he examined our books. Our professional relationship evolved into one of mutual respect and trust. "I appreciate your transparency," Alexia, James told me. "After a particularly long day of reviewing tax documentation, it makes my job much easier when the financial team is cooperative." As the audit progressed, I began noticing more unusual transactions. There were large payments to companies I had never heard of, with vague descriptions like consulting services or special project development. The amounts were significant, often in the range of $50,000 to $100,000 each. Even more concerning, these payments seemed to bypass our normal approval processes. Typically, any expenditure over $20,000 required multiple signatures and detailed documentation. These payments had only Richard's approval and minimal supporting documentation. I decided to bring my concerns to Richard directly. I compiled a list of the unusual transactions and requested a private meeting with him. He agreed to meet but kept checking his watch throughout our conversation. "Richard, I have noticed some large payments to companies that are not in our approved vendor list," I explained, sliding the documents across his desk. "And they all seem to be related to this Project Phoenix. Can you help me understand what this is about?" Richard leaned back in his chair and sighed. "Alexia, I appreciate your diligence, but as I mentioned before, this is a special project that Daniel is handling personally. Some aspects are confidential due to competitive concerns." His explanation seemed plausible, but something still felt off. Nevertheless, I nodded and gathered my documents. "I understand. I just want to make sure we have proper documentation for the audit." Richard smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. "Of course. I will speak with Daniel about providing more context for these transactions. In the meantime, just focus on your regular duties." I left his office feeling unsettled, but still trusting that there must be a legitimate explanation. After all, StartSphere had always operated ethically as far as I knew, and both Daniel and Richard had built respected reputations in the industry. Looking back, I should have recognized these as the first warning signs. The unexplained project, the unusual financial transactions, the subtle change in Richard's demeanor toward me. But at that point, I was still operating under the assumption that our executive team was acting in the best interest of the company. I had no idea how wrong I was, or how quickly things would deteriorate from there. In the weeks following my conversation with Richard, I noticed a distinct change in his behavior toward me. Our weekly one-on-one meetings, which had been a fixture on both our calendars for years, began to be rescheduled or canceled altogether. Emails that would normally receive prompt responses now sat in his inbox for days. When we did interact, his previously warm demeanor had been replaced with a cool professionalism that felt like a wall between us. The most telling incident occurred during a monthly financial review meeting. I had prepared a detailed analysis of our current spending patterns, including a section highlighting the increasing funds being allocated to unknown vendors. As I began to present this section, Richard abruptly interrupted me. "I think we need to focus on the marketing department overages today," he said, not meeting my eyes. "We can table the vendor discussion for another time." The other team members exchanged confused glances, but followed his lead. After the meeting, Richard hurried out without his usual casual chat, leaving me standing alone with my unused presentation slides. A few days later, I was working late, finishing some quarterly projections. Most of the office had emptied with only security and a few dedicated employees still around. I needed to ask Richard a question about some figures and walked toward his office. The door was slightly ajar, and I could hear voices inside. Richard and Daniel were having what seemed to be an intense conversation. "We need to be more careful," Richard was saying in a hushed tone. "The amounts are getting too large to hide easily." "Just keep it compartmentalized," Daniel replied. "No one person should have the full picture. That is why we created the shell companies in the first place." I froze outside the door, my heart racing. Shell companies, hiding amounts. This was far beyond a confidential R&D project. Before I could hear more, someone from the cleaning staff walked by, and I quickly retreated to my office, my mind spinning with what I had just heard. The next day, I tried to access some of the financial records related to Project Phoenix that I had previously reviewed. To my surprise, many of the files had been moved or had their permissions changed. When I asked our IT department about it, they informed me that Richard had requested a security review of financial documents, restricting access to certain files to need-to-know personnel only. Around this time, Richard began to mention a potential promotion for me. Alexia, with the company growing so quickly, we are considering creating a deputy CFO position, he mentioned casually as we passed in the hallway. Your name is at the top of the list. We should discuss it soon. The timing of this sudden career opportunity seemed suspicious, particularly given his recent coldness. It felt like an attempt to placate me to keep me focused on a future reward rather than current irregularities. My suspicions drove me to dig deeper. Late one evening, using my administrative access, I ran a comprehensive search for all transactions related to Project Phoenix. What I found was alarming. Over the past year, nearly $1 million had been transferred to a network of 5 companies. Further research revealed that all 5 companies had been incorporated within the last 18 months, had minimal online presence, and shared a registered address in the Cayman Islands. The next day, I confided in Melissa, my trusted colleague in the accounting department. We had lunch at a small cafe, 2 blocks from the office, to ensure privacy. Something is seriously wrong with these Phoenix transactions, I told her after checking that no one from our company was nearby. I think Richard and Daniel might be funneling money out of the company. Melissa's expression grew serious. I have noticed some strange entries too, she admitted. Last month, Richard asked me to process a wire transfer to Orion Global Consulting without the usual documentation. When I asked for the proper paperwork, he said it was coming, but to process it anyway because it was time-sensitive. I felt uncomfortable, but he is the CFO. This confirmation from Melissa strengthened my resolve to uncover the truth. That weekend, I dedicated myself to researching every company connected to Project Phoenix. I created spreadsheets tracking every payment-searched business registration databases, and even looked up the executives named in the incorporation documents. The breakthrough came when I discovered that one of the listed directors for Orion Global Consulting was Matthew Hughes. A quick social media search revealed that Matthew was Daniel's cousin. This was a clear conflict of interest that had never been disclosed to the board or shareholders. The picture was becoming clearer, and it was deeply troubling. It appeared that Daniel and Richard were using Project Phoenix to divert company funds to businesses connected to Daniel's family members. With the IPO approaching, the company's valuation would be based partly on its financial health and revenue projections. If millions of dollars were being siphoned off, it would not only constitute fraud, but could also significantly harm employees and future shareholders. I knew I needed to be careful. If Richard and Daniel were indeed engaged in financial fraud, confronting them directly could put my job and possibly more at risk. I decided to document everything meticulously. I created secure backups of all relevant financial records, took screenshots of suspicious transactions, and compiled a timeline of events, including dates, participants, and specific actions. I am going to prepare a complete report, I told Melissa during another off-site lunch, something that lays out exactly what is happening with these transfers. If my suspicions are correct, this needs to be brought to the board's attention. Melissa looked worried. Be careful, Alexia. Richard has a lot of influence with the board. Make sure your evidence is rock solid. Her concern was valid, but I felt I had a professional and ethical obligation to act. With the external audit still ongoing, I believed James Wilson might be an important ally. However, I needed to compile my evidence first to ensure I was not making accusations without substantial proof. By the end of the weekend, I had prepared a comprehensive report documenting every unusual transaction, the connections between the recipient companies and Daniel's family, the timeline of increased secrecy around Project Phoenix, and the problems, discrepancies in the official records. Looking at it all laid out chronologically and systematically, there was no innocent explanation I could imagine. I saved the report on an encrypted drive and made a physical copy that I stored securely at home. Tomorrow, I planned to schedule a meeting with Richard, giving him one chance to explain, before I took my findings to higher authorities within the company. I had no idea that my actions had already triggered a response, and that Richard and Daniel were already working on their countermove. Monday morning, I arrived at the office earlier than usual, rehearsing in my mind how I would approach Richard with my findings. I had decided to give him the benefit of the doubt, one last chance to explain the suspicious activities before I escalated the matter. I sent him an email requesting an urgent private meeting, and to my surprise, he agreed to see me right away. Richard's corner office had always intimidated me a little, with its floor-to-ceiling windows and minimalist expensive furniture. As I entered, he He gestured for me to sit in one of the sleek leather chairs facing his desk. "What is so urgent, Alexia?" he asked, his tone friendly, but his eyes watchful. I took a deep breath and placed a printed summary of my findings on his desk, keeping the full report hidden for now. "Richard, I have been reviewing the financial transactions related to Project Phoenix, and I have some serious concerns I need to discuss with you." His expression remained neutral as I outlined the pattern of payments to shell companies, the connection to Daniel's cousin, and the deliberate concealment of documentation. Only a slight tightening of his jaw betrayed any reaction. When I finished, Richard leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers. "Alexia, I appreciate your diligence, but I think you are connecting dots that do not actually connect. Project Phoenix is a special strategic initiative that requires a certain level of confidentiality." "But the payments to companies linked to Daniel's family," I began. Richard cut me off with a wave of his hand. "Matthew Hughes is a consultant with specialized expertise that happens to be related to Daniel. All of this was disclosed to the board. The Cayman Islands registration is for tax efficiency, which is completely legal and standard practice for many corporations." His explanation sounded rehearsed, too smooth. He continued, "I understand how without context these transactions might raise questions. That is precisely why we limited access to the full documentation. Corporate espionage is a real concern as we approach our IPO." I was not convinced. Then why were the normal approval processes bypassed? And why has access to files I previously reviewed been restricted? A flash of annoyance crossed Richard's face before his professional mask returned. "Security protocols, Alexia. Nothing more sinister than that. I think your concerns, while well-intentioned, are misplaced. Let me and Daniel worry about Project Phoenix. You have more than enough on your plate with the regular financial operations." The meeting ended with vague assurances that everything was above board, but I left Richard's office feeling more uncertain than before. His explanations were plausible on the surface, but failed to address the specific irregularities I had identified. That afternoon, I noticed the first signs of being systematically isolated. The weekly leadership team lunch happened without me being invited. When I passed by the conference room and saw the entire team there, including junior members who normally would not attend, the message was clear: I was being pushed out of the inner circle. The following day, my calendar notification informed me of a meeting I had not been aware of. Quarterly financial strategy session. A meeting I had always been part of was scheduled to begin in 30 minutes. When I arrived at the designated conference room, Richard looked up with mild surprise. "Oh, Alexia, I meant to tell you. We are restructuring these sessions. Going forward, Brendan will be representing the accounting department." He nodded toward Brendan Parker, a competent but relatively new senior accountant who reported to me. Brendan looked uncomfortable, but gave me a small, apologetic smile. "I see," I said, trying to maintain my composure. "Is there a reason I am being excluded?" "Not excluded," Richard corrected smoothly. "We are just streamlining the attendee list. I will brief you afterward." I left without making a scene, but the humiliation burned. Back at my desk, I found an email informing me that 3 of my key responsibilities, including oversight of the investment portfolio and tax planning strategy, were being temporarily reassigned to distribute the workload more evenly across the department. That evening, I stayed late again, using my still-active system access to search for more information about Project Phoenix. I discovered documents indicating that the project had a total budget of $2 million, far more than the $1 million I had already traced. The documents referenced a final phase scheduled to complete just weeks before the planned IPO announcement. I decided it was time to speak directly with James Wilson, our external auditor. The next day, I asked if he would join me for coffee to discuss some audit-related questions. We met at a small cafe several blocks from the office. "James, I need to share some concerns with you confidentially." I began once we were seated in a quiet corner. "I have discovered financial irregularities that I believe warrant further investigation." James listened attentively as I outlined my findings, occasionally asking clarifying questions. His expression grew increasingly serious. "Have you brought these concerns to Richard?" he asked when I had finished. "Yes, yesterday." He dismissed them and provided explanations that do not align with the documentation I have found. James nodded thoughtfully. "This is certainly concerning. As the external auditor, I have an obligation to investigate any potential financial improprieties. I will need to see the evidence you have compiled." I promised to provide him with copies of my documentation securely. As we parted, James added, "Alexia, be careful. If what you suspect is true, there could be significant consequences for everyone involved." I returned to the office to find an increasingly hostile environment. Colleagues who had previously been friendly now avoided eye contact in the hallways. Conversations stopped abruptly when I entered the break room. My emails to team members received delayed and minimal responses. Melissa confirmed my suspicions during a hurried conversation by the elevator. "Richard called me into his office yesterday," she whispered. "He warned me about becoming too involved in office politics and mentioned how associating with the wrong people could impact my performance review. It was pretty clear he was talking about you." The isolation tactics extended beyond the finance department. Jordan, my friend from IT, stopped joining our regular coffee breaks. When I messaged him asking if everything was okay, his response was brief and formal. "Swamped with work right now. Need to focus on priorities." Later that week, I overheard two colleagues from marketing discussing me in the restroom, unaware of my presence in one of the stalls. "I heard she is having performance issues," one said. "Apparently there are concerns about her judgment." "That is surprising," the other replied. "She always seemed so competent." "Well, Richard has been having private conversations with department heads. Reading between the lines, I think they are building a case to let her go." Hearing my professional reputation being dismantled behind my back was devastating, but rather than intimidating me, it strengthened my resolve to uncover the truth about Project Phoenix. That night, I began creating duplicate records of all relevant documents, storing them securely, both in encrypted cloud storage and on a personal drive I kept at home. I also started a detailed journal, documenting the sudden changes in my work responsibilities and the isolation tactics being employed against me. If this was heading where I feared it was, I wanted a complete record of events. The stakes had clearly been raised. What had begun as financial discrepancies had evolved into what felt like a coordinated campaign to discredit and isolate me. I knew I needed to proceed carefully, but I also knew I could not back down now. Too much was at stake, not just for me, but for the company, its employees, and its future shareholders. The following Monday, I received an unexpected email from Human Resources requesting my presence for a performance review. This was unusual timing as our regular performance evaluations were conducted annually in October, still 4 months away. The HR representative, Amanda Collins, greeted me with professional politeness, but there was a noticeable lack of warmth. Richard was already seated in the small conference room when I arrived. "Alexia, we have some concerns about your recent performance that we need to address." Amanda began opening a folder containing what appeared to be a formal performance improvement plan. What followed was surreal. Richard methodically listed a series of alleged performance issues that had supposedly been occurring over the past 3 months. According to him, I had missed key deadlines, made calculation errors in important reports, and demonstrated an increasingly adversarial attitude toward leadership decisions. "These claims are completely unfounded," I protested, my voice steady, despite my racing heart. "I have documentation proving my reports were accurate and submitted on time." Richard slid a document across the table. "This quarterly tax assessment contains a $200,000 calculation error that could have resulted in significant penalties if it had not been caught by my review." I quickly scanned the document, immediately spotting the issue. "This is not the version I submitted. The figures have been altered." I pulled out my tablet and accessed my secure cloud storage, where I kept backups of all my work. "Here's the original report I sent with the correct calculations." Richard waved dismissively. "Anyone can alter a document after the fact. The version in our official system is what matters, and that version contains errors." It was clear to me what was happening. They were building a case for my termination, creating a paper trail of fabricated performance issues. The realization that they would go to such lengths was both shocking and frightening. The meeting ended with me being placed on a 30-day performance improvement plan, a common precursor to termination. As I left the HR office, I felt a mixture of anger, betrayal, and profound stress. The company I had dedicated 6 years of my career to was not just pushing me out, but actively trying to destroy my professional reputation. That night I barely slept. The stress was taking a physical toll. My stomach was in constant knots, and tension headaches had become my daily companion. But rather than give in to despair, I channeled my anxiety into action. I spent the entire evening reviewing everything I had discovered about Project Phoenix, looking for patterns or details I might have missed. I created a timeline of every transaction, every communication, every change in company behavior toward me. When laid out chronologically, the correlation between my inquiries about Phoenix and the deterioration of my standing in the company was undeniable. Around midnight, while cross-referencing bank records, I found something I had overlooked, a series of smaller transactions between $5,000 and $10,000 each, that when added together formed a substantial amount. These payments were to a company called Artemis Consulting, which shared an address with one of the Cayman Islands entities I had already identified. Further research revealed that Artemis had been registered just 2 weeks after I first asked Richard about Project Phoenix. It seemed they had created yet another shell company to distribute the funds more discreetly, likely in response to my questions. This discovery led me down another path. If they were creating new entities to hide the money trail, where else might funds be flowing? I expanded my search parameters to look for any unusual transactions, regardless of the project code attached to them. By 3 a.m, fueled by coffee and determination, I had uncovered something far worse than I initially suspected. Project Phoenix was not merely about diverting company funds to Daniel's family. It appeared to be a sophisticated scheme to artificially inflate the company's valuation before the IPO. The shell companies were being used to create fake revenue streams. StartSphere would send money to these entities, which would then contract with StartSphere for consulting services or software licensing, creating the illusion of higher revenue and more diverse client relationships than actually existed. With the IPO planned for early next year, this scheme would allow the executives, particularly Daniel and Richard, who held significant equity, to cash out at a massively inflated valuation before the truth was discovered. It was not just unethical. It was illegal, constituting securities fraud. The next day, exhausted but resolute, I attempted to schedule a meeting with Barbara Chen, our Chief Operating Officer. Barbara was respected for her integrity and had been with the company almost since its founding. If anyone in leadership would listen objectively to my concerns, it would be her. To my dismay, her assistant informed me that Barbara was unavailable for the foreseeable future and directed me back to Richard for any financial matters. Later that day, I learned through the company grapevine that Barbara had suddenly taken a leave of absence for personal reasons. The timing could not have been more suspicious. That afternoon, I received an anonymous email from an account I did not recognize. The message was brief but chilling. Stop digging into things that do not concern you. Some questions are better left unasked for everyone's sake. I immediately forwarded the email to my personal account and added it to my growing file of evidence. The threat, while vague, confirmed that my investigation had not gone unnoticed. 2 days later, I was working late again, one of the few people still in the office. As I passed by the executive conference room, I heard raised voices. Curiosity and concern led me to slow my pace. She needs to be dealt with now, not in 30 days, Daniel was saying, his tone harsh. The audit will be concluding soon, and she has been spending too much time with Wilson. The performance improvement plan gives us legal coverage, Richard replied. Firing her outright could raise red flags, especially with the auditors. I do not care about red flags at this point. She is a liability we cannot afford with $2 million on the line and the IPO approaching. Find a way to accelerate the process. Create an incident if you have to. Their words sent a chill down my spine. I was not just being pushed out. I was being viewed as a threat that needed to be dealt with. The reference to creating an incident was particularly alarming. Would they go so far as to fabricate something that could damage my career beyond StartSphere? The next day brought another painful revelation. Jordan, the IT specialist who had been avoiding me, approached me in the parking garage after work. He looked nervous, glancing around to ensure we were alone. Alexia, I cannot be seen talking to you, he said quickly, but I wanted you to know that I was instructed to monitor your system activities and report back to Richard. I have also been asked to restrict your access to certain financial databases effective tomorrow morning. Jordan, do you know what is going on? I asked, hoping he might have information I could use. He shook his head. I just know it is bad. Richard and Daniel have been holding closed-door meetings with various department heads. Everyone is being told different stories about you, all of them negative. He glanced at his watch. I need to go. Be careful, Alexia. These guys play hardball. As Jordan hurried away, the full reality of my situation came crashing down. This was no longer just about protecting my job or my reputation. If what I had discovered was accurate, Daniel and Richard were orchestrating a multi-million-dollar fraud that would harm the company, its employees, and future investors. I spent the evening meticulously organizing all my evidence and preparing detailed notes on everything I had learned. If I was going to be forced out, I wanted to ensure that the truth about Project Phoenix would not be buried with my departure. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when I revisited the IPO filing preparations. The final phase of Project Phoenix coincided exactly with the quiet period before the IPO. During this time, financial scrutiny would be intense, but also narrowly focused on the metrics relevant to valuation. Once the IPO was completed and the executives had sold their initial shares, any subsequent discovery of fraud would come too late for the early investors. It was an elegantly designed scheme that exploited the complexities of corporate finance and the temporary information asymmetry that exists during an IPO process. The more I understood it, the more impressed I was by its sophistication, and the more disgusted I became at the callousness it represented. As I finally fell into a troubled sleep that night, I knew that the confrontation was coming soon. Richard and Daniel clearly wanted me gone before the audit concluded. I needed to be prepared for whatever they might do next, and I needed to decide how I would respond when the moment came. 3 days later, late on a Thursday afternoon, the moment I had been dreading finally arrived. My phone rang, and Daniel's executive assistant informed me that my presence was requested in the CEO's office immediately. The polite phrasing did nothing to mask the command. As I rode the elevator to the executive floor, I mentally rehearsed what I would say. I had decided that honesty was my best approach, laying out my concerns directly, and gauging their reactions. Despite everything, some naive part of me still hoped there might be an explanation I had overlooked, that I might be wrong about the extent of their deception. Daniel's office was larger than most studio apartments, with artistic lighting that highlighted abstract sculptures and original paintings. Richard was already there, standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city. Daniel sat behind his massive desk, his expression unreadable. "Alexia, please sit down." Daniel gestured to a chair positioned in front of his desk, conspicuously separate from the comfortable seating area where more amicable conversations took place. I sat maintaining eye contact with him. "You wanted to see me?" "Yes," Daniel said, his voice professionally pleasant but lacking any warmth. "We need to discuss a serious matter that has been brought to my attention." Richard moved from the window to stand beside Daniel, a united front against me. "It has come to our attention that you have been accessing confidential financial information outside your designated areas of responsibility," Richard said. "I have been doing my job as chief accountant," I replied calmly. "That includes reviewing financial transactions across all departments to ensure accuracy and compliance." Daniel leaned forward slightly. "There is a difference between fulfilling your responsibilities and conducting your own unauthorized investigation. We have logs showing you accessing files related to Project Phoenix repeatedly after hours, despite being told it was a confidential executive initiative." "I was concerned about financial irregularities," I stated, deciding to be direct. "Payments to shell companies connected to your cousin Matthew, artificial revenue creation through circular transactions, all seemingly designed to inflate our valuation before the IPO." A flash of anger crossed Daniel's face before he controlled it. "That is a serious accusation and completely unfounded. Project Phoenix is a legitimate strategic initiative that requires confidentiality for competitive reasons." "Then why the shell companies?" I asked. "Why the hidden transactions? Why the efforts to remove me from meetings and restrict my system access?" "This is exactly the kind of paranoid speculation we are concerned about," Richard interjected. "You are creating conspiracy theories based on fragments of information you do not understand." Daniel's tone hardened. "Alexia, we have been patient with your performance issues, but this crosses a line. You are making defamatory claims about executive decisions without proper context or authorization." "I have documented evidence," I countered, my heart racing but my voice steady. "Transactions that bypass normal controls, companies registered within days of my initial questions, connections to your family members that were never disclosed to the board." Daniel's face darkened. "Be very careful about spreading these false allegations. Corporate defamation is a serious legal matter. Your misinterpretation of confidential financial strategies could cause significant harm to this company." The threat was clear, but I stood my ground. I am not misinterpreting $2 million being funneled through shell companies just before our IPO. Daniel exchanged a glance with Richard, then sighed dramatically. I had hoped we could handle this professionally, but you leave us no choice. Richard slid a document across the desk toward me. We are implementing an organizational restructuring effective immediately. Unfortunately, your position has been eliminated. I stared at the termination agreement. Despite having anticipated this moment, the reality of it still hit like a physical blow. Restructuring. We both know that is not the real reason. The decision has been made, Daniel said flatly. Human resources will handle the details. You will receive 8 weeks of severance pay contingent upon signing a confidentiality agreement that prohibits you from discussing internal company matters, including your unfounded theories about Project Phoenix. And if I do not sign, I asked, already knowing the answer. Then we would be forced to terminate you for cause based on your performance issues and unauthorized system access. That would of course result in no severance and a problematic reference for future employment. Richard's tone was almost apologetic, as if he were explaining an unfortunate necessity rather than delivering a threat. I felt a surge of emotions, anger, and betrayal foremost among them. 6 years of dedication, of late nights, and weekend work of putting the company's needs ahead of my own, and this was how it ended, with threats and lies. You will receive a calendar invitation for your exit interview tomorrow morning with HR, Richard continued. Please use today to collect your personal belongings. IT will be restricting your system access within the hour. Your company badge will be deactivated at the end of the day, Daniel added. Security will escort you out once you have gathered your things. The humiliation of being treated like a criminal after years of loyal service was almost too much to bear, but I managed to maintain my composure, standing up straight and looking both men in the eye. You are making a mistake, I said quietly. Daniel's smile was cold. No, Alexia. The mistake was yours, thinking you understood things beyond your pay grade. Corporate finance at this level is complex, and not everyone is equipped to see the bigger picture. The condescension in his tone was the final insult. I turned and walked out without another word, my mind already racing with what I would do next. Back at my desk, I found a new email in my inbox. The calendar invitation for my exit interview had already been sent, scheduled for 9 a.m. the following day. Amanda from HR would conduct it with Richard present as well. My colleagues watched with wide eyes and hushed whispers as I packed my few personal items. The security guard who arrived to escort me out was Troy, a friendly man who had greeted me every morning for years. Now he avoided my eyes as he waited by my desk. I am sorry about this, Alexia, he said quietly as we rode the elevator down. For what it is worth, I think you are one of the good ones. I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. As we reached the lobby, Troy hesitated. Take care of yourself, he said, and I caught the genuine concern in his voice. Outside, the late afternoon sun was bright, a stark contrast to the darkness I felt inside. I sat in my car for several minutes, trying to process what had just happened and what it meant for my future. My career, which I had built so carefully over the years now, had a black mark that would be difficult to explain to future employers. But, beneath the shock and grief, another emotion was building: determination. Daniel and Richard had underestimated me. They thought that by removing me from the company they could silence me and continue their scheme unimpeded. They were wrong. That night was one of the longest of my life. I barely slept, reviewing all the evidence I had gathered and considering my options. I could go to the SEC with my suspicions, but without access to the internal systems, my evidence might not be compelling enough. I could consult an attorney about wrongful termination, but legal battles were lengthy and expensive, with uncertain outcomes. As dawn broke, I made my decision. I would attend the exit interview as expected, but I would not go quietly. If Daniel and Richard wanted to play hardball, they were about to discover they were not the only ones who knew the game. I reviewed the calendar invitation once more, noting the attendees: Amanda Collins from HR and Richard Maxwell. With a smile that held no humor, I clicked accept on the invitation. But before sending my response, I made one small but significant addition to the meeting. Under optional attendees, I added James Wilson, the external auditor who had been working with me for the past 6 months. It was a simple action, just a few clicks, but I knew it would set in motion consequences that neither Daniel nor Richard had anticipated. With a deep breath, I clicked send and prepared myself for the final confrontation. The morning of my exit interview dawned clear and bright, a beautiful day that seemed at odds with the turmoil inside me. I dressed with particular care, choosing a professional navy blue suit that had always given me confidence. Today, I would need every advantage I could get. I spent an hour organizing my evidence into a clear chronological presentation. Each transaction, each suspicious company registration, each instance of unusual activity was documented with screenshots, dates, and explanatory notes. I placed these in a leather portfolio, along with a copy of the company's ethical conduct policy and relevant sections of securities law. As I drove to the office for what might be the last time, I rehearsed what I would say, anticipating their questions and planning my responses. The nervousness that had plagued me through the night had transformed into a steady resolve. Whatever happened today, I would stand by the truth. I arrived 30 minutes early, sitting in my car in the parking garage to collect my thoughts. My phone buzzed with a text from James Wilson. Received your meeting invitation. Interesting timing. I will be there. Those simple words gave me a boost of confidence. James was a respected professional whose presence would change the dynamics of what Richard and Amanda had likely planned as a routine exit process. At 5 minutes before 9, I entered the building, signing in as a visitor at the security desk, where I had once been greeted by name every morning. Troy was not on duty, replaced by a guard I did not recognize, who barely looked up as he handed me a visitor badge. The Human Resources conference room was on the second floor, a small, windowless space designed for private conversations. As I approached, I saw Amanda arranging papers on the table with Richard checking his phone beside her. Neither had noticed me yet. James arrived at the same moment, approaching from the other direction. Richard looked up at the sound of footsteps and froze when he saw James walking toward the same conference room. "James, what are you doing here?" Richard asked, confusion evident in his voice. "I was invited to this meeting," James replied calmly, holding up his tablet to show the calendar invitation. Richard turned to me, his expression shifting from confusion to anger as he realized what I had done. "This is an internal HR matter. The auditor has no place here." Actually, James interjected before I could respond, as the external auditor conducting an active review of the company's finances. I have a professional obligation to be informed of any terminations within the financial department, especially at the executive level. Amanda looked uncertainly between Richard and James. I was not informed that Mr. Wilson would be joining us. He was added as an optional attendee, I explained, maintaining a professional tone. Given that my role involved extensive collaboration with the audit team, it seemed appropriate to include him. Richard's jaw tightened, but with James present, he could hardly object without appearing suspicious. "Fine. Let us get this over with." We all took seats around the small table, the atmosphere tense. Amanda began with rehearsed pleasantries, explaining the exit process and sliding the termination agreement toward me for signature. Before we proceed, I said, not touching the document, "I want to clarify the reason for my termination." As was explained yesterday, Richard replied stiffly, "The company is undergoing restructuring." "Interesting," James commented. "In my discussions with leadership last week about the audit, there was no mention of restructuring the finance department." Richard shot him an irritated glance. It was a recent decision. "So recent that it has not been documented in any board minutes or formal communications?" James asked. "The paperwork is still being processed," Richard said, his discomfort growing visible. "This is really not relevant to today's meeting." James opened his tablet. "Actually, it is highly relevant. You see, I received an automated notification this morning that a name on the termination list matched a name on my key personnel watch list for the audit. That name was Alexia Sullivan." Richard paled slightly. "What are you talking about? What watch list?" "Standard audit protocol," James explained. "Key financial personnel are flagged in our system. Any significant changes in their status trigger automatic reviews to ensure there are no implications for financial oversight or reporting continuity." This was the moment I had been waiting for. I opened my portfolio and slid a document across the table to James. "You might find this relevant to your review. It is a summary of financial transactions related to Project Phoenix, including transfers to shell companies with connections to CEO Daniel Hughes and discrepancies in reported revenue." James accepted the document, scanning it with a practiced eye. Amanda looked increasingly uncomfortable while Richard's face had gone from pale to ashen. "This is highly confidential information." Richard began reaching for the document. James held it away from Richard's grasp. "As the external auditor, all financial information falls within my purview." He continued reading, his expression growing more serious with each page. "These transactions, they appear to show systematic financial misrepresentation." "That is a mischaracterization," Richard insisted. "Project Phoenix is a legitimate strategic initiative." "Then you would have no objection to opening the full financial records for immediate review," James countered. "As part of our standard protocol, when key financial personnel are terminated during an active audit, I am authorized to implement enhanced review procedures." Richard's phone rang. He glanced at it, and his expression tightened further. "Excuse me, I need to take this." He stepped out of the room, closing the door behind him. "What exactly is happening here?" Amanda asked, looking confused and concerned. James turned to her with professional courtesy. "Miss Collins, in light of what I have just reviewed, I am invoking Section 7.3 of the Audit Engagement Letter. This requires an immediate freeze on all assets related to the transactions identified in this document, pending full investigation." Amanda's eyes widened. "An asset freeze? But that requires board approval." "The engagement letter signed by your board grants me this authority under specific circumstances," James explained. "The coincidence of these suspicious transactions and the abrupt termination of the chief accountant who discovered them constitutes such circumstances." The door opened, and Richard re-entered, his face now a mask of barely contained rage. "The meeting is postponed," he announced. "Amanda, you are needed elsewhere. Alexia, you may leave the premises. We will reschedule." James stood firmly. "I am afraid that is not possible. I have already initiated the asset freeze protocol. All financial activities related to Project Phoenix are suspended pending review. The board has been notified, as have the relevant regulatory authorities." Richard looked as though he might explode. "You have no right. This is an internal company matter. Actually, when potential securities fraud is identified during an audit, I have not only the right, but the legal obligation to act." James replied calmly. "My team is already securing relevant records. The $2 million allocated to this project will remain frozen until a full investigation is completed." The door burst open again, and Daniel stormed in, his face contorted with fury. "What the hell is going on, Richard? Why is the board calling me about an asset freeze?" Before Richard could answer, James stepped forward. "Mr. Hughes, I am James Wilson, from Anderson Financial Oversight. As the external auditor, I have identified potentially fraudulent transactions requiring immediate investigation. I have initiated standard protocols to secure financial records and protect company assets." Daniel turned to me, his eyes blazing. This is your doing." "I simply invited the appropriate person to my exit interview," I replied calmly. "If Project Phoenix is the legitimate strategic initiative you claim it is, you should have nothing to worry about." Daniel's phone rang again, and he answered it with barely contained rage. "Yes. No. I did not authorize." "What? The entire board now?" He listened for a moment, his expression shifting from anger to something approaching fear. "Yes. I will be right there." He hung up and glared at all of us. "This meeting is over. Richard, come with me. The board has called an emergency session." He turned to me one last time. "This is not finished." As they departed, Amanda excused herself as well, clearly wanting no part of whatever was unfolding. James and I were left alone in the conference room. "That went about as I expected," James said with a slight smile, though perhaps with more drama than usual. "What happens now?" I asked, the adrenaline that had carried me through the confrontation beginning to ebb. "Now the real work begins," James replied. "My team will conduct a thorough investigation. Based on what I have seen so far, there appears to be substantial evidence of financial misconduct. The board will need to decide how to proceed once all the facts are established." "And what about my termination?" I asked suddenly, remembering my precarious employment status. James chuckled. "I would be very surprised if that stands. In fact." His phone buzzed, and he glanced at the message. "The board is requesting your presence at their emergency session. It seems they have questions only you can answer." As we walked to the boardroom, the magnitude of what had just happened began to sink in. By a simple act of adding James to my exit interview, I had triggered a series of events that were now beyond anyone's control. The truth about Project Phoenix would come to light, and Daniel and Richard would have to face the consequences of their actions. The emergency board meeting lasted for hours. I presented my findings, methodically answering questions from increasingly alarmed board members. James provided his professional assessment, confirming that the patterns I had identified warranted serious concern. By late afternoon, the board had reached several decisions. Daniel and Richard were placed on immediate administrative leave, pending a full investigation. An interim CEO was appointed from among the board members, and my termination was officially rescinded. Ms. Sullivan, the board chair, said, as the meeting concluded, "The board apologizes for this unfortunate situation. We value integrity in our financial operations, and your actions, while uncomfortable for some, demonstrate exactly the kind of ethical commitment this company needs." As I left the boardroom exhausted but vindicated, I knew that my professional journey at StartSphere was entering a new chapter, one I could not have anticipated just 24 hours earlier. The fight was not over, but the first decisive battle had been won. In the weeks that followed, the full extent of Daniel and Richard's scheme came to light. The forensic accounting team discovered that Project Phoenix was indeed exactly what I had suspected, an elaborate fraud designed to artificially inflate the company's valuation before the IPO. The $2 million that had been funneled through the network of shell companies was just the beginning. Additional hidden transactions were uncovered, bringing the total to nearly $4 million. Much of this money had been directed to companies owned by Daniel's family members, or close associates disguised as consulting fees or strategic partnerships. The consequences were swift and severe. 3 weeks after my near termination, both Daniel and Richard were officially fired by unanimous board vote. The company issued a press release citing irreconcilable differences regarding financial management practices, a corporate euphemism that fooled no one. What surprised me was how quickly the situation escalated beyond internal corporate discipline. James Wilson, fulfilling his legal obligations as an auditor, had reported his findings to the Securities and Exchange Commission. Within days, federal investigators arrived at our offices with subpoenas for records related to Project Phoenix. I spent hours being interviewed by SEC investigators, walking them through the evidence I had gathered and explaining how I had connected the disparate pieces. They were particularly interested in the timeline of events, noting the correlation between my inquiries about Phoenix and the sudden efforts to remove me from the company. "You potentially saved a lot of people from significant financial harm," one investigator told me after a particularly long session. If this scheme had continued through the IPO, thousands of investors would have purchased shares in a company with fundamentally misrepresented financials. The board, eager to salvage the company's reputation and move forward, made a surprising announcement at the end of that tumultuous month. They wanted me to serve as interim chief financial officer while they conducted a search for permanent executive leadership. "Your financial acumen and ethical backbone are exactly what StartSphere needs right now," the board chair explained when offering me the position. "You know our financial systems better than anyone, and you have demonstrated an unwavering commitment to integrity even when it was personally costly." The promotion came with a substantial salary increase and a seat at the executive leadership table. It was vindicating, of course, but more important to me was the opportunity to help rebuild the company's financial foundation on principles of transparency and ethical conduct. My first actions as interim CFO included implementing new financial oversight protocols and establishing an ethics hotline where employees could report concerns anonymously. I also initiated a comprehensive review of all financial transactions from the previous 2 years to ensure no other irregularities had been missed. The news about Daniel and Richard continued to worsen. The SEC investigation expanded into a criminal probe, with federal prosecutors bringing charges of securities fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy. Both men were facing potential prison sentences and significant financial penalties. The legal proceedings would likely drag on for years, but their careers in corporate finance were effectively over. Despite the professional validation, the emotional aftermath was complicated. I experienced a lingering sense of betrayal that was difficult to process. I had trusted Richard as a mentor and respected Daniel as a visionary leader. Learning that both had been willing to not only commit fraud but also destroy my career to cover it up left emotional wounds that would take time to heal. The stress of the previous months had taken a physical toll as well. The The constant anxiety, sleepless nights, and emotional turmoil had left me exhausted on a level I had never experienced before. Now that the immediate crisis had passed, my body seemed to be demanding the rest it had been denied. "You need to take some time for yourself," Melissa advised during one of our now resumed lunch meetings. "You fought a huge battle and won, but victories can be depleting too." She was right. I arranged for a 2-week vacation, my first real break in years. I spent it at a quiet cabin by a lake, hiking during the days and watching sunsets in the evenings, gradually feeling my nervous system reset from the constant high alert it had been on. Upon my return, I found the office atmosphere noticeably changed. The culture of fear and secrecy that had pervaded during Daniel's leadership was being replaced with more open communication and collaborative decision-making. Employees who had distanced themselves from me during my isolation now sought to reconnect, often with awkward but sincere apologies. Jordan was among the first to approach me. "I should have stood by you," he said during a coffee break. "I knew something was wrong, but I was scared for my job. It is not an excuse, just the truth." Fear is a powerful motivator, I acknowledged, and they cultivated it deliberately. Rebuilding these relationships was a gradual process. The trust that had been broken could not be instantly restored, but with time and consistent actions, new foundations could be established. 6 months after the Phoenix scandal broke, StartSphere had undergone a remarkable transformation. With new leadership, strengthened financial controls, and a renewed commitment to ethical business practices, we were beginning to regain the trust of clients and partners. The IPO plans had been delayed but not abandoned, with a more modest but honest valuation target set for the following year. As for me, I declined the board's eventual offer to make my CFO position permanent. The experience had clarified my personal and professional values, and I realized that I wanted to use what I had learned to help other companies establish robust ethical financial practices. I eventually founded a consulting firm specializing in corporate financial ethics and whistleblower protection, helping organizations create cultures where concerns could be raised and addressed before they escalated into crises or frauds. My experience at StartSphere became a powerful case study that I shared with appropriate anonymity in corporate training sessions. Looking back on that turbulent period, I recognized how easily the situation could have gone differently. If I had not documented the evidence meticulously, if I had not built a relationship of trust with James Wilson, if I had not taken that final strategic action of including him in my exit interview, the outcome might have been drastically different. Daniel and Richard's scheme might have succeeded, and my career might have been the only casualty. The most profound lesson I took from the experience was about the true nature of courage. It is not about fearlessness, but rather about acting with integrity even when fear is present. There were many moments during those months when I questioned myself, when the easier path of silence and compliance seemed tempting. Choosing to stand alone against powerful figures required a kind of inner strength I did not know I possessed until it was tested. I also learned about the paradoxical nature of professional relationships. The workplace can foster deep connections and community, but these bonds are always shaped by power dynamics and self-interest. Recognizing this reality is not cynical but practical, allowing for more authentic and resilient professional connections. Perhaps the most valuable insight was about the importance of systems and structures that protect integrity. Individual ethical actions matter enormously, but they are strengthened and sustained by formal mechanisms like independent audits, whistleblower protections, and regulatory oversight. My individual stand might have failed without these larger systems of accountability to support it. As I built my new career, I carried these lessons with me, sharing them with clients and incorporating them into the ethical frameworks I helped design. The experience that could have ended my professional life instead became its defining chapter, transforming a painful ordeal into a source of wisdom and purpose. In those moments when doubt creeps in, when standing up for what is right seems too difficult or costly, I remember that morning in the exit interview, the look on Richard's face when he realized his carefully constructed scheme was unraveling. It reminds me that truth, while sometimes delayed, has a power that deception can never match. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you had to stand alone for what was right? What gave you the courage to take that stand? I would love to hear your stories in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share it with others who might benefit from knowing they are not alone in their ethical struggles. Remember, integrity might be tested in solitude, but its impact ripples far beyond our individual actions. Thank you for joining me on this journey, and may your own path be guided by both wisdom and courage.